Hi, my name is Flip Gettings, and I have taken a particular interest in one of my books assigned to me for seminary. That book is Love Your God with All Your Mind by J.P Moreland. This book is particularly interesting to me because the author is taking a strong stance against anti-intellectualism in the church, particularly the evangelical church. This is an issue that I have noticed for a couple of years now, but has truly been going on long before that. And it hits close to home for me because from the age of 15 to 17, I really flirted with atheism, but it was a reasoned and logical approach to the faith that God used to preserve my faith. In this book, he points out 5 ways in which anti-intellectualism has affected not only the church, but the world's culture at large. I'm going to be discussing 2 of those ways here today in this video. The first is the misunderstanding of faith's relationship to reason. And I and J.P. Moreland would make the argument, I believe, that faith and reason are deeply interwoven. However, the evangelical church and much of the world would argue that faith and reason are these 2 opposing forces. The second point I'll be discussing is weakened world missions. How our misunderstanding of faith's relationship to reason has hurt our world missions. I believe these 2 points within themselves are interwoven. And I believe many of the 5 points he makes are interwoven with each other. One thing that J.P. Moreland points out that was particularly interesting to me was 1 Peter 3:15. This is interesting because I believe in this verse, Peter is setting an expectation for believers to be prepared with a reasoned and logical argument and defense of our faith to non-believers. 1 Peter 3:15 reads, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." The interesting thing, that word for defense in the original Greek is apologia. Now, you may recognize that word from apologetics or an apologist. In layman terms, apologetics is just the defense of the faith. But that word, apologia, means a spoken, reasonable defense. And it was often used in the context of the court of law. So Peter is, like I said, setting this expectation that we would have a reasonable defense ready for when people bring opposing views or opposing arguments to us. I also believe this is particularly significant in a day and age where Christianity is becoming a little more popular and Bible sales are going through the roof. We've seen people like Wes Huff on Joe Rogan and Piers Morgan, which is crazy. Another interesting thing is, according to American Bible Society, 44% of Generation Z is, and I quote, extremely curious about Jesus. Now that's significant because nearly half of the next generation is extremely curious about Jesus. We have to be prepared when they come to us as Christians to ask certain questions or bring up certain arguments that we are ready to defend the faith and be able to plant those seeds. Now, I believe one way in which we do this and we strengthen our world missions and have a better understanding of faith's true relationship to reason is by knowing the audience that we're preaching to or that we're discussing with. And I believe the gospel authors would agree with this sentiment. I'm specifically going to use the example of Matthew and Mark. Now, it's important to understand with Matthew is writing his gospel to the Jewish people. So Matthew has a large focus on the prophecies of the Old Testament that Jesus fulfilled, on the teachings of Christ, and showing the connection between the Old Testament and Jesus to his audience. He also opens up his gospel with a genealogy from Abraham to Jesus, but he does this in 3 different genealogies. The first one is Abraham to David. The second one is David to the Babylonian exile. And the third is the Babylonian exile to Jesus. Now, the significant thing about this is that this isn't an exhaustive genealogy. This is actually, and much in line with Jewish culture at the time, a genealogy that skips certain generations that aren't necessarily significant or clumps generations together. Now, because Matthew did this, each generation is 14 generations from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian exile, and from the Babylonian exile to Jesus. This is significant because, as many of you may know, the Hebrew language actually has a numerical value attached to each letter. And when you add up all of the letters of David, you get 14. So in the mind of the first century Jewish person reading this gospel account, they would see 14, 14, 14 and think David, David, David. Oh, Matthew is telling us about the son of David, the prophesied Messiah. This is who David's teaching us, or who Matthew is teaching us about. That's significant because that speaks to the Jewish person and exposes and provides to them the truth of Christ with knowledge and terminology that is relevant to them. However, Mark is actually writing to the Roman world. So Mark takes a different approach. Mark doesn't focus on the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled as much or the teachings of Jesus as much. He rather focuses largely on what Jesus does, because that's what's going to catch the mind of the Roman person. So, Matthew and Mark coordinate their gospel accounts based on the audience they're trying to reach. We have to do that too. I truly believe if we study these arguments, whether we are discussing this with a Jewish person or we're discussing this with a worldly person who's a Gentile and unfamiliar with the Old Testament, whether we're having this discussion with a Muslim, whether we're having this discussion with an atheist or a Buddhist, we need to study the arguments and how we can defend our faith against those faiths. I believe at that point, that is when we can both have a better understanding and grasp of faith's true relationship to reason, as well as we can strengthen our world missions and actually be able to plant seeds and effectively preach the gospel to people based on the truth of the gospel message. I thank you for listening to my video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you for your time. God bless.